My brother won Winemaker of the Year for a wine he couldn't even tell you the grape varietal of. The award, a heavy polished slab of oak and brass, sat on the mantel of our family's tasting room, right under a sprawling photo of him, Leo, laughing in the vineyard. That photo was taken on the one day he'd spent working the harvest that year, mostly for a social media campaign. So when they unanimously decided my new fermentation methods were too risky and not in line with the brand's aesthetic, I just nodded. I said, "You're right. Let's do it your way." And I let them. I followed every one of Leo's visionary directives to the letter. The call came 6 months later at 4:52 a.m. on a Tuesday. The sun wasn't even up, but I was, drinking coffee and looking at schematics for a new irrigation system for my next project. My father's voice was a ragged whisper, a sound I hadn't heard since his heart scare 5 years ago. "Clara, it's all gone. The whole vintage. It's vinegar. The bank called. They're pulling the line of credit." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I looked out the window of my small rented cottage, miles away from the vineyard that had consumed a decade of my life. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and my voice was perfectly even. "What did Leo say?" There was a choked sound on the other end. That was my answer. That was before they understood that it wasn't just the wine that was gone. It was the vineyard's soul. And I had been the one to quietly pack it up and walk away. To understand why I let a $2 million harvest turn to acid, you have to understand Blackwood Creek Vineyard. To the world, and to anyone reading Vintners Quarterly, it was the idyllic American dream. A sprawling 100-acre estate in Northern California, passed down through my mother's family, revitalized by her visionary son, Leo, and his supportive parents. The narrative was perfect. The handsome, charismatic young winemaker breathing new life into old vines, creating a brand that was both rustic and chic. Our Instagram was a masterpiece of golden hour shots, artfully arranged charcuterie boards, and candid photos of Leo, looking thoughtful among the barrels. What it wasn't a picture of was me, Clara, at 3 a.m. checking the Brix levels of the grapes during a sudden heat wave. It wasn't a picture of my soil analysis spreadsheets, or the proprietary yeast strain I spent 3 years cultivating from a wild spore I found on a forgotten corner of the property. It wasn't a picture of me, with a degree in oenology and viticulture from UC Davis, doing the actual back-breaking, soul-crushing, scientific work of making wine. I was the head winemaker. That was my official title. But in the family, I was the operations manager, the boots on the ground, the details person. Leo was the visionary. My parents were the ambassadors. This meant Leo handled marketing, which involved flying to trade shows, having long lunches with distributors, and charming wine bloggers. My parents handled the tasting room, which meant they'd host weekend events, pour the finished product, and tell the romantic story of the brand. My job was to make the product they were selling. From pruning the dormant vines in the freezing January rain to the final bottling in late spring, the entire cycle of creation was my responsibility. They only ever saw the beginning and the end, the beautiful green vines in summer and the delicious wine in the glass. The messy, complicated, exhausting middle, that was all me. And for a long time, I told myself that was okay. We were a team. Everyone had their role. The vineyard was the family's legacy, and I was honored to be its steward. I loved the dirt, the science, the unpredictable dance with nature. I didn't need the spotlight. I just needed the respect. But respect was in shorter supply than a good Cabernet in a bad year. The disconnect wasn't a sudden earthquake. It was a series of tiny, almost imperceptible tremors that slowly cracked the foundation of our partnership. It started with small things. I'd spend a week drafting a new trellising plan to improve sun exposure on the Chardonnay grapes, and Leo would present it in a meeting as an idea I've been kicking around. I'd warn them that a new, cheaper fertilizer they wanted to use would alter the soil's pH and affect the taste profile in 3 years' time. My mother would wave a dismissive hand and say, "Oh, Clara, don't be so technical. It's organic. That's what matters for the brand." They started calling my scientific expertise my pessimism. My careful planning was my anxiety. My insistence on quality control was me not being a team player. They loved the idea of the vineyard, but they hated the reality of it. They wanted the poetry of winemaking, not the chemistry. They wanted to talk about terroir and tasting notes, but they didn't want to hear about mildew, frost warnings, or fermentation temperatures. I was the one who stayed up all night with the wind machines when a late frost threatened to kill the budding vines. I was the one who had to fire a seasonal worker for being drunk on the job. I was the one who had to negotiate with the bottle supplier when a shipment came in flawed. They were insulated from every problem. Their only job was to sell the success I produced. And the more successful I was, the more invisible I became. The more awards my wines won, the bigger Leo's picture got in the magazines. He was the artist. I was the canvas he painted on. He'd bring a date to the vineyard and walk her through the barrel room, reciting lines I'd written for our technical sheets, explaining the malolactic fermentation process as if he'd discovered it himself. I would stand a few feet away, covered in grape must and sweat, and he wouldn't even introduce me. I was just part of the scenery, the quiet, reliable, ever-present machinery that made his dream possible. The resentment started as a low hum in the back of my mind, a background noise I could mostly ignore. But last fall, that hum became a roar. The grenade that finally blew everything apart wasn't a family argument. It was an email. An email from a senior editor at Vintners Quarterly, the most prestigious wine publication in the country. They were planning a massive feature story for their spring issue. The New Guard, America's most innovative winemakers. And they wanted to feature Blackwood Creek. Specifically, they wanted to feature Leo. The email was forwarded to me by my mother with the subject line, "Look, so proud." I wasn't CC'd by the magazine, of course. They didn't know I existed. The editor praised Leo's daring, intuitive approach and his innate understanding of the land. He wanted to do a multi-day photo shoot and an in-depth interview, focusing on the creation of our flagship wine, the Legacy Pinot Noir. My Pinot Noir. The one that had won 3 gold medals. The one I developed using that proprietary yeast strain. The one whose entire fermentation process I had documented in a 200-page logbook that I kept locked in my office. I sat in my small, cluttered office, the air thick with the smell of fermenting grapes and damp earth, and I read the email chain. Leo's replies were effusive, charming, and full of lies. He talked about his process. He said, "I have a very hands-on, instinctual method. I listen to the grapes." I almost choked on my coffee. Leo couldn't listen to the grapes if they screamed at him through a megaphone. Then came the part that stopped my heart. My father had replied to the editor, too. He wrote, "We couldn't be prouder of Leo. He inherited his grandfather's touch with the land. His sister, Clara, helps with the day-to-day operations. But the vision, the artistry, that's all Leo. Helps with the day-to-day operations." It was a dismissal so profound, so complete, it felt like an erasure. I wasn't a partner. I wasn't the winemaker. I was the help. In the official story of my own life's work, I had been relegated to a footnote. That night, there was a celebratory dinner. My parents opened a bottle of the '08 vintage, a wine I hadn't even been there for. Leo was glowing, talking about the photo shoot, what he was going to wear, the key messages he wanted to get across. He looked at me across the table and smiled, a genuine, happy smile. "Can you believe it, Clara? Vintners Quarterly. We did it." We. The word hung in the air, a perfect, hollow sphere of hypocrisy. I wanted to scream. I wanted to take the bottle and smash it against the wall. I wanted to throw my 200-page logbook on the table and quiz him on pH levels and titratable acidity until his charming facade cracked. But I didn't. I just smiled back, a tight, thin smile that didn't reach my eyes. "Congratulations, Leo," I said. "You deserve it." And in that moment, a decision formed in my mind, not with anger, but with a cold, clear, crystalline certainty. If they wanted Leo the visionary, the artist, the star, they were going to get him in full. My reaction wasn't explosive. It was silent and methodical. The next morning, I went to my office before anyone else was awake. I took my logbooks, all 10 of them, one for every year I'd been there, and packed them into a box. I took the temperature and fermentation data, the soil composition charts, the records of every experiment, every failure, every breakthrough. I went to the lab and carefully transferred my proprietary yeast culture, C-1 for Clara's Wild Boar 1, from the main incubator into a small portable container. This yeast was the secret to the Pinot Noir's unique flavor profile, its earthy cherry and spice notes that no one else in the valley could replicate. It was my intellectual property, developed on my own time. I packed it all into my car. Then I went back inside and began my new job, being the perfect operations manager. The planning for the next vintage, the one that would follow, the award winner, was already underway. This was the moment I would usually present my strategy for the year. Which blocks to harvest first? The fermentation temperatures, the type of oak barrels for aging. This year, I didn't. At the planning meeting, I just sat there with a blank notepad and a pen. Leo, high on his impending fame, was full of ideas. "I'm thinking we go for a bolder, more fruit-forward profile this year," he announced, pacing in front of the fireplace. "Less time on the skins. And let's use those new American oak barrels for everything. I love that vanilla note." It was a terrible idea. The Pinot grapes we grew were delicate. They needed gentle handling and subtle French oak, not the aggressive char of new American oak that would bulldoze their nuances. My father nodded enthusiastically. "Great thinking, son. Keep it fresh. Keep it modern." My mother suggested we harvest a week earlier than usual to capture that vibrant acidity. Another disastrous plan that would lead to thin, unripe wine. I waited for them to look at me, to ask for my input, my professional opinion. The winemaker. But they didn't. They were a closed loop of self-congratulation. Finally, my dad turned to me. "So, Clara, can you make that happen?" I looked down at my blank notepad. I thought about the years of fighting them on details like this, of being called difficult and negative for simply doing my job. I thought about the magazine article that would soon be printed, erasing me from my own story. I looked up and gave them the most cooperative smile I could muster. "Absolutely," I said. "A bold, fruit-forward Pinot, harvested early, aged in new American oak. I'll draw up the work plan today." For the first time in years, they all beamed at me. I was finally being a team player. I spent the rest of the day creating a detailed schedule to execute their terrible ideas perfectly. I would give them exactly what they wanted. To understand the weight of that decision, you have to go back to the beginning. 10 years ago, Blackwood Creek wasn't a glossy magazine feature. It was a liability. It was 100 acres of neglected vines my grandparents had planted, which my parents had inherited and had no idea what to do with. The land was about to be sold to a developer to pay off estate taxes. I was 24, fresh out of my program at UC Davis, full of ambition and working as an assistant winemaker at a big corporate vineyard. My dad had just had a minor heart attack, a wake-up call that made him obsessed with the idea of legacy. He and my mom pitched me the idea over a tense dinner. "You have the skills, Clara," my dad had said, his voice earnest. "Leo has the charm, the salesmanship. We can do this, together. A real family business. Something to leave behind for your children." Leo was all in. He was tired of his entry-level marketing job. He saw the glamour, the lifestyle. He designed a logo before we even had a business plan. I was the one who was hesitant. I knew what it would take. It wasn't a lifestyle. It was a life sentence of hard labor. But they were my family. My dad looked so hopeful, so fragile. I felt the immense pressure of their dream, and I caved. I quit my stable job, invested my entire savings, $30,000, and moved into the dusty old foreman's cottage on the property. The first 2 years were brutal. I was a one-woman show, replanting dying vines by hand, repairing ancient irrigation lines, sleeping in 4-hour shifts during harvest to monitor the fermenters. Leo would come up on weekends with his friends, drink beer, and talk about his vision. My parents would fret about the color of the tasting room walls. The first time I saved us, no one even knew it happened. It was our 3rd year. A vicious strain of powdery mildew, fueled by a damp spring, was creeping through the vineyard. It's a silent killer that can ruin an entire crop. I caught it early, on a single leaf on a vine at the far end of the property. The standard treatment was expensive, and we were already running on fumes. So, I spent 3 weeks, sun up to sundown, manually applying a natural labor-intensive spray I'd learned about in a graduate seminar. I went row by row, vine by vine. I saved the crop. When the grapes came in healthy and perfect, my dad clapped Leo on the back. "You see? This land is magic. It just knows how to provide." Leo just smiled, accepting the credit as if it were his birthright. I was too exhausted to correct them. That was the first time I realized they didn't see my work. They only saw the results, and they attributed those results to luck, to the land, to Leo's magical touch. And my contribution, my sacrifice, was completely invisible. That pattern would repeat itself for the next 7 years. Every success was theirs. Every problem was mine to solve in silence. The confrontation didn't happen in a boardroom. It happened where the crime was committed, in the cellar. 6 months after I'd agreed to their plan, the Vintners' quarterly article came out. It was even worse than I had imagined. A 6-page spread. A photo of Leo looking heroic, staring out over the vines at sunset. A photo of my parents laughing with him. I was mentioned once in passing as Leo's sister Clara, who manages the vineyards team. I wasn't the winemaker. I was a manager of an unnamed team. I was a ghost in my own house. By then, the damage was already done. The wine, made precisely to their specifications, was sitting in the barrels, and it was a disaster. The early harvest meant the grapes lacked sugar and complexity. The reduced skin contact meant the color was pale and the tannins were weak. And the aggressive new American oak had completely overwhelmed what little flavor there was, leaving a harsh, woody vanilla bomb of a wine that tasted cheap and unbalanced. It was unsellable. They didn't notice, of course. Leo was too busy doing interviews. My parents were framing the article. I just waited. The call came when the first distributor, who had pre-ordered the vintage based on last year's success, received a sample. He rejected the entire order. Then the second did. Then the bank, seeing the rejected orders, got nervous and pulled our operating line of credit. That's when my father called me at 4:52 a.m. They convened an emergency family meeting that afternoon. We stood in the cold, sterile silence of the barrel room, the air thick with the smell of failure. My mother was crying softly. My father was pale, his face a mask of disbelief. Leo was angry, pacing back and forth. "It must have been the weather," he fumed. "Or a contaminated batch of yeast. Something went wrong with the process." He looked at me, his eyes narrowed. "You were in charge of the process, Clara." I didn't say a word. I just walked over to my old desk in the corner, pulled out a folder, and laid 4 printed emails on top of a barrel. "You're right," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the big room. "Something did go wrong. Let's review." I tapped the first email. "Leo, this was your directive from October 12th. A bolder, more fruit-forward profile. Less time on the skins." I looked at him. The result is a wine with no structure and a pale, anemic color. I tapped the next email. "Mom, your suggestion from October 14th. Harvest a week early to capture vibrant acidity." I looked at her. The result is a low-alcohol, unripened wine that tastes thin and green. I moved to the third email. "Dad, your email from October 15th, agreeing with Leo's idea to use 100% new American oak." I looked at him. The result is a wine that has no character of its own, only the overpowering, cheap flavor of a vanilla car air freshener. I paused, letting the silence hang. Leo stared at the emails, his face turning from red to white. You did this on purpose," he whispered. "No," I said calmly, looking him directly in the eye. "I did my job. My job, as you all so clearly defined it, is day-to-day operations. I executed your vision. Perfectly. The problem is, your vision was flawed, and you were too arrogant to listen to the one person who knew it. My mother gasped. Clara, how could you? How could I? My voice finally cracked with the weight of a decade of frustration. How could you? You put my name on this vineyard. You took my life savings. You consumed 10 years of my life. And then you publicly erased me. You stood by and let my brother take credit for my mind, my sweat, and my soul. You didn't want a winemaker. You wanted a machine. So I gave you exactly what you programmed. This, I said, gesturing to the silent, useless barrels. This is not my failure. This is a monument to your incompetence. The fallout was swift and catastrophic. The vineyard, without a viable product and with its line of credit frozen, was effectively bankrupt. My parents, who had leveraged their retirement savings against the business's success, were facing financial ruin. The news traveled fast in the small gossipy world of winemaking. The story they spun was that I was vindictive, unstable, that I had sabotaged the vintage out of jealousy over Leo's success. Some people believed them, the ones who just read the magazines and saw the pretty Instagram pictures. But the people who mattered, the other growers, the barrel makers, the seasoned distributors, they knew. They knew that wine like our legacy Pinot didn't happen by instinct. It happened with skill. I didn't stick around to watch the empire crumble. I had already packed my bags. 2 weeks after the confrontation in the cellar, I was gone. I moved to a small town in Oregon's Willamette Valley, another renowned Pinot Noir region. I didn't have a job lined up, just my savings, my reputation among those who actually knew the industry, and the small, refrigerated container of CW1 yeast. The calls and texts from my family were relentless at first. Guilt trips from my mother, angry, rambling voicemails from my father, a single 2-word text from Leo. I hate you. I blocked their numbers. For the first time in 10 years, my phone was silent. The quiet was terrifying at first, and then it was liberating. About a month after I moved, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. It was Marcus Thorne, the owner of a prestigious, century-old vineyard in the valley, a man who was practically royalty in the wine world. Clara, he said, his voice deep and gravelly. I heard what happened down at Blackwood Creek. I also heard you were the one who really made that 21 Pinot. I was stunned into silence. I never believed that pretty boy brother of yours had it in him. He continued, chuckling. I'm looking for a new head winemaker. Someone with a spine who trusts science over marketing. I've tasted your work. It speaks for itself. The job is yours if you want it. It was a lifeline, but it was more than that. It was validation. It was proof that my work, my true work, hadn't been erased after all. It had just been seen by the wrong people. I took the job. The lesson in all of this isn't about revenge. Letting that vintage fail wasn't a punishment. It was an education. It was the only way to make them see the value of something they had refused to acknowledge. The most painful truth I had to accept was that they didn't just take my work for granted. They fundamentally did not respect it. To them, My scientific, methodical craft was just a glorified form of manual labor, a necessary but unglamorous trade, while Leo's marketing was the high art. They worshipped the storyteller, not the author. They believed their own myth, and in their myth, I was a supporting character, a helpful cog in the machine of Leo's genius. Walking away from my family's legacy was the only way to start building my own. I had to let their dream die so that mine could live. For years, I had defined my worth by my ability to hold their world together, to be the silent, competent pillar that supported their ambitions. My identity was tied to the soil of that vineyard, to the point where I couldn't tell where the vines ended, and I began. Leaving was an amputation. It hurt. But it was also the only way to stop the rot from spreading to my soul. True legacy isn't something you inherit or slap a label on. It's the knowledge you build, the integrity you maintain, and the respect you earn through the work itself. They thought the vineyard was their legacy, but it was just land. The real legacy was the skill, the passion, and the magic yeast I had cultivated, and I took all of it with me. It's been 2 years now. My life is unrecognizable, in the best possible way. The vineyard where I work now, Thornhill, just won Wine of the Year at the Oregon Wine Awards for a Pinot Noir I developed. We called it Vindication. The press release, which I wrote myself, detailed the complex yeast cultivation and soil-specific fermentation techniques involved. Marcus, my boss, insisted my name and title, Clara Vance, head winemaker, be in the first sentence. The silence from my family has been absolute. I heard through the grapevine, pun intended, that they had to sell Blackwood Creek to a large corporate beverage company for a fraction of its worth. It's now producing a generic mass-market table wine. The brand, the legacy, is gone. Leo, I heard, is working in real estate. Last month, I received an email. The sender was an address I didn't recognize. The subject was blank. I almost deleted it, but curiosity got the better of me. The message was short. Hi, Clara, it's Leo. I know it's been a while. I was at a restaurant last night and the sommelier recommended a wine. He said it was made by one of the best new winemakers in the country. It was yours. I tried it. It was incredible. Better than the legacy. I just wanted to say, I get it now. I stared at the words for a long time. There was no apology, no request for forgiveness. It wasn't much, but it was honest. I thought about replying, about all the things I could say, but I realized I didn't need to. My work had already spoken for me. My success was my reply. I closed the email and went back to my work, checking the temperature charts for a new batch of Chardonnay. I had vines to tend to. I had my own legacy to build. And for anyone out there who has ever been the secret engine in someone else's success story, the ghostwriter of their own life. Let me tell you this. Your work matters. Your contribution is real. And you are allowed to stop being the operations manager of someone else's dream and become the visionary of your own. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is to step back, be silent, and let people experience the full consequences of your absence.